Hi everyone, and thanks for being with me. I'm doing this live feed without Avery today because Avery's unwell, so glad that perhaps you could be with me. Make a comment below, talk about some of the subjects that I'm talking about today, because they are varied and they are different. In that is my commentary about what's happening in politics here in Australia and also around the world. So this is an opportunity to have a conversation about things that matter to me and maybe just matter to you as well. I'm sure that some of the things that I'm about to say to you are pretty controversial, but nevertheless, they are my opinion. Now, I've had some people criticise me recently in some of the posts that I've put out, whereby I have become anything but apolitical, and particularly political in relation to Donald Trump. And I had someone comment to me recently that because I was a therapist, that it is not keeping of me to be able to say things that are political because because as a therapist that would be influencing what other people think. And I just need to be clear that as a social worker I never ever made comments to people about their political views or try to persuade them to think differently than the way they were thinking. That was counter to anything I would have done as a social worker and as a therapist. So I just want to be clear about that in case there's somebody watching this who may remember the roles that I used to play as a therapist, but am now not playing. I'm simply a social commentator who would like to have had this opportunity when I was doing therapeutic work, but couldn't because of my commitments to social work. So that is my explanation. You care to accept it, fair enough. If not, that's fine as well. But please make a comment if you've got anything that you'd like to say about anything which I say from this point on. Now, there's a lot happening in politics around the world, and this is my opportunity once a week to do a live feed. You can actually subscribe to my channel on YouTube, which I would encourage you to do if you want to hear further comments as well, or whether you wish to be one of those people who tends to make comments about some of the things that I have said. So please become part of the discussion. That's really what this is about. So those people on Facebook can do the same. And of course, those on YouTube would be glad to hear from you. So I'm going to kick off today with something that I think concerns all of us, and that is how the tariffs in the United States are going to affect Australia. As it stands right at this particular point in time, Albanese has contacted Trump and they've had a discussion about some exemptions for us. And this has been left a little bit up in the air because Trump simply doesn't know what he's doing anyway, and he probably doesn't know where Australia sits on the map and doesn't realise that we're paying him $800 million at the moment to develop his submarine industry in the United States. So we're paying a substantial amount of money, a process which I don't necessarily agree with. I think we should become less relying on the United States over time, and that we should do our own thing and look for other alliances apart from those offered to us by the US. So at the moment, we have given the United States, as part of the AUKUS deal, some $800,000. And $800 million, pardon me. And this has presented kind of an issue, I think, for the Albanese government, because they just can't find a way to push back against the chaos that is Donald Trump. And particularly now that we're caught up in this tariff argument in relation to how we should be experiencing their tariffs imposed upon us, particularly in relation to steel and aluminium. Now, Trump has said he's going to think about it. Well, you know, the reality is, does Trump really take much time to think about anything at all? He just has a brain fart and then allows that to become policy. And in relation to Australia, I think that we should not be holding our breath in relation to the degree to which Trump should start to consider anything that is appropriate for us in terms of exemptions, because it just ain't going to happen. And the thing that I guess concerns me the most about that is that if it doesn't happen, the Liberal Party will come back at the Labor Party and suggest, as they often do, and particularly through Sky News, the Liberal Party network, will certainly be suggesting that in reality Albanese is weak because he wasn't able to do what Turnbull was able to do some years ago when Turnbull had the exemptions when Trump 1.0 chose to put some tariffs on Australia. Now, it's a different Trump this time. This time the Trump has very little boundaries, none whatsoever, doesn't even care about Australia. And the fact that we need to be able to just keep in mind that here in Australia we have a surplus with the United States. So in other words, we import far more than we export to the United States. So we're not, from the United States perspective, we are a good friend. We actually owe them money as opposed to them owing us money. And this is something that I think that we should be mindful of in terms of this exchange, because Trump will wind up punishing us for doing nothing more than being a good friend, because this is the way Trump treats his friends. So I want to take us to an article that appeared in the Guardian, I think it must have been. And in this particular article, it says that US says Australia broke verbal commitment to limit aluminium exports. The US has accused Australia of breaking a verbal commitment to limit aluminium exports in the formal order imposing a 25% tariff on the commodity. As we reported earlier, Donald Trump said he would give great consideration to exempting Australia from the tariffs after a phone call on Tuesday morning with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. The official proclamation to impose the tariff, which was published after the phone call, appears to explain why Australia was not exempt from the outset. The former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, negotiated a carve-out from steel and aluminium tariffs during Trump's first term, as I've already explained to you. The proclamation read, the volume of US imports of primary aluminium from Australia also has surged, and in 2024 was approximately 103% higher than the average volume for 2015 through 2017. Australia has disregarded its verbal commitment to voluntarily restrain its aluminium export to a reasonable level. So in other words, what happened was we dumped a lot of the aluminium and steel on the US during this period in which they had these tariffs. And, the percentage was, significant, I guess. But nevertheless, we made some money from all of that. So I would suggest that was a smart move, quite frankly. But according to Trump, that was not a good move. And so what we're left with now is a situation whereby Trump is likely to turn around and say, bugger you, we're going to now decide to tariff you because we see now that you were taking advantage of us when it came to these tariffs originally. So let's just see how this plays out. I'm not all that hopeful that it will work out in our favour, but it will affect certainly the steel and aluminium industries. Now, my argument around this all along has been, if this is the case, then the best thing for us to do is to look for other markets. And this is my whole point about relying on the United States for things which we do no longer need to rely on them for. Now, there are lots of other markets in the world that are buying our steel and aluminium, particularly China. So even though China's economy is not all that crash hot right at this moment, and it's looking at a decline, they still need a lot of steel and aluminium for their production. So to turn to them as a source is a great idea. And also there's India. Let's send more to them. There's also Europe. So there's this block of countries that we could be exporting to, and we should be looking now to those particular markets and forget about the United States at all, because the United States, quite frankly, are no longer our friend. Under Trump, everybody that sits outside the United States is an enemy. Even if you're Canada, you're an enemy. If you're Panama, if you're Danish, and you have a territory called Greenland, you are an enemy. So everybody is the enemy. So let's confront that as a reality. And now let's do something that is really, really smart, which is say, bugger you, United States. We're going to do our own thing and look for other markets now that are going to be more beneficial to us. And we're not going to be beholden to them in the same way that we've been beholden to you. And also, we could threaten to actually start to use the $800 million that we've offered you, and the more, so this is billions of dollars we'll be paying you for your submarine industry. We could actually say to you, well, we're just not going to pay that anymore until such time as you get rid of those tariffs. So we could, in effect, punish them. We have a big stick, but whether or not the government has the guts, now that's both sides of Parliament, whether they have the guts to do that is another issue altogether. But in my view, they should. Be interested to know what you think in relation to all of that as well. So let me know in the... So I've got so Kristen here has put in a comment to me. I can't see those comments on Facebook. I reckon the US with the right to free speech is to reach. They are wary of our controllers. I don't, Kristen. If you could just elaborate on that, that would be really helpful. So. So let's just carry this a little bit further. I want to talk also about, so we should not be beholden to the United States. Let's deal with that. This is an opportunity for us to get rid of that tie that we have to them and start doing our own thing. Now, the other thing that I think was really interesting was this comment also on The Guardian, which is like Trump, Peter Dutton's attack on DEI allow him to punch down without leaving any obvious bruising. Now, the issue here is that, and I've been wondering about this too, is the degree to which Dutton and the Liberal Party in particular may start to think that whatever's happening in the US and the way the United States is managing their own administration, whether that's something that we could do here in Australia. Now, Dutton has already appointed Senator Price as our version of Doge, and he has also suggested that there should be an issue around waste in Australia and that we should be looking at that. Now, I am the first person, well, not the first person, but I do admit that within government there is a lot of waste. There's no disputing any of that. That money is used to pay people excessive amounts of wages. And I think one of the areas that could be looked at is the amount of money that's spent on chief executives of departments within the government. I think there's a lot of waste that happens there. I don't think those people are worth the $500,000, $600,000 that they're paid. And that's one place we could start. It's unlikely, but certainly that is one area which would be really helpful to us to think about. And there's lots of other areas in which there's obviously some significant waste. It was interesting to note the other day that Sky News decided to try to capitalise on this issue around waste by pointing out that the Foreign Affairs Department spends a lot of money doing things in other countries that, and I did a post on this actually a few days ago, but certainly the Foreign Affairs Department tends to do a lot of, spend a lot of money on things that one does wonder about. But we don't know exactly their strategy for doing these things, for having Indigenous people go to some country around India. I forget which country it was now. But there's some things that we do which certainly may be questionable. I understand that. But we certainly don't need to put in someone like Elon Musk in order to be able to sort that out. And I don't know whether we need necessarily Senator Price to do it as well, because one of the things that she wants to cut is the amount of money going to Indigenous affairs. And, I think they think that because she's an Indigenous person that would be viewed as appropriate. I don't think it is, because I don't think the Indigenous people themselves necessarily think that she's the right person for that job either. But that's what they're doing. So this article, like Trump, Peter Dutton's attack on DEI allows him to punch down without leaving any obvious bruising. So the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has lurched into 2025 like a Queensland plob, armed with a phone book, desperately looking for someone to wallop. After advancing the attacks on Indigenous flags. So this is a couple of things that he's done, which I think we really need to note, which is important. He's attacked the Indigenous flag and acknowledgement of country. So he's doing this DEI thing where, we should not do, we should not have the Indigenous flag up when he's standing addressing the nation. And that we should not acknowledge the acknowledgement of country that we do with most sporting events. I disagree greatly with all of that. Don't know what you think. Dutton has failed to pick an Australia Day fight over his suggestion that councils should celebrate with sufficient patriotic fervour, whatever that means. So there's this notion around us becoming more patriotic and that we should endeavour to fly the Australian flag, forget about our cultural background, forget about Indigenous people, forget about the past, forget about the invasion, all those things that I think are important. We should dispense with all of those and move on. But in actual reality, they're the things that matter to us. They are our past, they are our history, and we can't ignore them. To prove he's not a single shitstorm politician, he expanded his gaze onto the broader canvas of DEI, the diversity, equity and inclusion programs similar to those that Donald Trump is blaming for everything from California bushfires to the Washington DC air crash in the US. Like Trump, his strategy appears crude but simple. Divide your way into power by convincing disaffected voters there are other groups in society who are getting a better deal than they are. As this week's Guardian Essential report shows, Dutton has a bit to work with. And they have this chart, which I found interesting. So the two columns on the left, 32% here and the 38% by the general population. And these here on the right, I couldn't figure out what these were initially. These are the people from these groups. So those who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, 32% general population, say they have more power, and 38% they have less power. And amongst Indigenous people, that's 26 and 34. Those who identify as LGBTQ+, this is an interesting one, 27% more power, 36% of the general population say they have less power. And amongst that group themselves, 15% say they've got more power, and 54% say they have less power. And so it goes down through the working class. So older Australians, 80% have more power, 48% say they've got less power, 7% more power, 63% of that group say they have less power. And so it goes on. So you can see the trend. The trend basically is saying that in Australia, there's a heck of a lot of areas that we could work on to where there are groups who are feeling that they're not being acknowledged, they're not being recognised, that they are in fact being ignored by politicians in general. And these are target areas that could be worked on from the Labor Party, so or Liberal Party, I should say, where we ask people to say which groups have more power and less power compared to other groups. They are more likely to see groups they identify with as being in deficit, while others are perceived to do better. While some of these findings are marginal, others are quite stark, especially around sexual and gender identity and disability. Older Australians are also much more likely to see themselves lacking power compared to other groups. So this was, and they point out this, I think it's important, this was the logic behind the campaign against the voice to Parliament. A majority of Australians were convinced that having a right to be heard written into the Constitution represented a special treatment for First Nations people. And I guess the problem is that when we start to focus on a specific interest group, there's always going to be a group who's going to feel left out. And this is the problem with politics generally, is that they're trying to work out the way that they can pick and choose who are the most important groups, who have got the largest voting bloc, and who therefore will be the most important people in terms of selling our policies to. So at the moment, the focus mainly is about homelessness, the focus is about housing, the focus is about cost of living. So the more that we build and the more that we establish policies that sit around those issues, that they're going to be the ones that resonate with the population. Of course, the issue primarily for the Labor Party is that there is very little movement in that area, even though there's not a massive decline in terms of our cost of living. But certainly the perception is that things are tougher in the community now than what they were 3 or 4 years ago. And this is a problem for Labor, because how do they sell people the notion that things are better, that healthcare has improved, the ability to access doctors has improved, that bulk billing numbers have increased considerably under Labor, that if you're a student and you've got a massive debt, some of that debt is being diminished for you through the government. If you've got, and there's a whole host of issues, things that they've done. For example, another one, I guess, is with regard to families who need to be able to put their kids in some sort of care arrangement during the day. So monies have been provided for that. There have been an increase in wages generally in Australia compared to the last 10 years or so. That there have been progress that has been made. But the problem that the Labor Party have is that they're unable to sell it because people aren't interested in it. All they do is see how much it costs when they go to do their shopping and how much their electricity bills are costing. So these are the issues for Australian people. And it seems to me that something needs to be done about that. So the conversations, unfortunately, aren't being productive for the Labor Party as a result. So there's just this other one here. So this is an interesting title, which I don't know if you'll be able to see all of this, but basically it says that you could dress Dutton as Ham, but that doesn't make him PM material. And it goes on to say, if you cast your mind back to the period soon after the Morrison government was tossed out on its ear in 2022, losing 19 lower house seats, it would have been a brave person who predicted that the coalition under Peter Dutton will be back in contention at the next election. Indeed, after Liberals lost the seat of Aston in April 2023, the first time a government had won a seat from an opposition at a by-election in more than 100 years, their outlook was bleak. But here we are. Dutton and the opposition look to have upward momentum, and Anthony Albanese and his government do not. The trend towards the coalition in the polls has become so sustained that the looming election is shaping as a contest to see which side will get the opportunity to form a minority government. Dutton is now looking for the holdout voters, such as women of all ages and young people, to try to get the Liberals enough seats to have an edge over Labor. His reputation is a bloodless, tough guy, can only take him so far. There's a need to sell him as a more relatable everyman in the hope of securing those extra votes. The Liberal Party has been attempting to soften or just plain humanise Dutton's public image by showing him in its messaging as a nice, thoughtful, caring fellow. A mate of mine, a former political reporter who lives on the other side of the world, describes the campaign as Dutton dressed up as Ham. So we're trying to sell Dutton, and I love this graphic. So they're trying to sell Dutton as this really this different person, as a soft, gentle, caring, loving individual, which he frankly isn't. So whether this is going to work or not remains to be seen. But we need to be mindful that at the end of the day, this isn't necessarily about whether, in my view, whether Albanese is seen or perceived as weak, or Dutton is perceived or seen as being inconsequential or cruel or whatever you might like to attach to Dutton. What it is about is whether or not the particular party that you want to vote for has the policies that are going to impact you. And so we need to be careful that we don't make this a populist sort of vote, that we're not looking for characters that are going to be more appealing to us because they're the tough guy. And I guess this is the lesson that we need to try and learn from the United States experience, is that we should not be looking to people for their popularity because they appear to be tough. We should be looking to parties who are prepared to put forward policies which are going to impact all of us. So one of the ways by which we can do that is simply, and this is where I think the Labor Party should be selling their stuff a little bit more than what they do, because they have been in power for 3 years. They have done a lot, I think, in terms of improving people's lives, given the crap that they were dealt with by the Liberal Party. And they have done what they can to make things better. They've worked to improve those things. But nevertheless, they've been poor at selling it, and that's the problem. Whereas Peter Dutton has offered very little at this point and is waiting for the last minute, as most people do in opposition, in order to present his policies. The only policies that he has at the moment that seem to be relevant is the effort to be able to sell nuclear energy, which is a long way off. You know, it's going to be 10, 15 years off before we see any benefits from any of that, if at all. And there again, it can't be argued that it's going to be cheaper either, particularly given the total cost, which we will be paying for as taxpayers. And the other issue, I think, primarily that we need to start to consider is that there is likely to be a pushback against Dutton about all of that, for that matter. But the other policy, which he actually introduced during this week, which they've been talking about in Parliament, is taking away the taxation or in relation to lunches, so that if you were, you'd be able to declare on your tax lunches that you provide as a business for your staff or for colleagues or whatever it might be. So they're the two big policies that they've launched at the moment. They haven't done anything on housing. They haven't put anything forward in terms of cost of living. That they will cut Social Security, and they will actually confront NDIS, and they'll deal with that as well. So I think there's some things that we need to be mindful of in terms of the Liberal Party. But to be fair, let's wait and see what policies are on offer from them, and we'll see where we go to from there. So someone has made a comment here, which is, as usual, Libs hit the immigration button these days to gain votes. And that's the other thing too, I think, is that they have, and that it's really important for us to acknowledge that. So this is what this person's put up here. I don't know if I can make that any bigger for you or not. Probably not. But certainly they have said that they will take away these, that they'll do whatever they can to limit immigration, because here in Australia we simply don't like having people come from overseas, even though most of us have at some point come from overseas, unless you're Indigenous. So the question is, where can Labor turn for ideas on how to win the Australian election? And there's an interesting article as well, which is I found quite fascinating, because one of the questions really we all need to be asking is, well, what can we do? What can Labor Party do in this particular area? So where can they turn for ideas on how to improve any of this? So they could look at, and this is interesting, Mexico, because the Mexican Prime Minister, or President, I should say, Claudia Sheinbaum, has become the face for confronting Trump because of the tariffs imposed by the United States on Mexico. And she's a good example, and I think this points out some really interesting points in terms of the way we can actually confront some of these issues. The ALP could follow the Mexican example, where an incumbent won an election in a cost of living crisis, which is what we're in right at this moment, by combining radical policies with symbolic measures. So last year, as an anti-incumbent wave swept the globe, Mexico's ruling left-wing Morena party recorded a landslide victory. So as they were confronted with the cost of living crisis in the same way that we are, even worse, in fact, in Mexico, she was able to win an election in a landslide. And that wasn't because she focused on popularism. It was because she focused on the issues that concerned people. So those who study Latin American politics say the result offers lessons for Australia's Labor government in its quest to buck the global trend and retain power at this year's general election. Claudia Sheinbaum won the election convincingly to become Mexico's first female president by supporting the policy platform pioneered by her predecessor and part founder Andrés Manuel López Obrador. That platform included minimum salary rises, direct cash transfers and labour reforms, along with price controls and grocery staples such as rice, soap and toilet paper. These measures proved enough to overshadow concerns about the government handling of violence, lawlessness and rising government debt. And these were significant problems, as we're probably well aware, in Mexico. Renee Rijon, a researcher for the University of Melbourne who investigates the political impacts of structural injustice, says Mexico voters knew who to vote for when it came to combating the higher cost of essentials, including food. While many things may be falling apart, the government did the one thing they said they would do regarding their social program. And this is really, really fundamentally important, and we should acknowledge this. Put the poor first, says Rijon, who specialises in Mexican politics. Overall inflation is higher and living costs are higher, but thanks to these targeted social programs, people on the lower socioeconomic class are better off, or at least they think they are. I'll finish off with this bit. The Mexican election result rubbed against the counter-incumbent surge evidence in 2024 polls in the US, UK and Senegal, as well as the slump in support for the ruling African National Congress in South Africa. Far-right parties created upheaval for incumbents in France and Germany, while Canada's long-serving Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saw his support evaporate before even going to the polls. So the issue here is we can, and it is possible, to focus on the things that matter, to work with, or to focus at least in areas where it's not discounting the poor. So it's not about giving tax cuts to the rich, which is what Trump is doing. In fact, it's notable that Trump has chosen not to do anything in relation to, so he's chosen not to do anything that is going to focus on the working class and the unemployed and those people on benefits. He's ignored them entirely. At the moment, it's all about doggy and doing what he can to rip the government apart. That's his sole focus. Whereas in Mexico, they chose to focus on the working class and the poor. And that's the message for us. They are people in Australia who vote. We have compulsory voting if you're registered. So this is important. And this is where the Labor Party could be focusing. And not just the Labor Party, the Liberal Party. You know, if the Liberal Party want to win this election, that's where they need to be focusing. Because the reality here in Australia is that the independents, the Teals, are normally focusing on that area, including the Greens. And that even though the Greens are losing support, the Teals are gaining support because they're perceived as the party or the group of people who are best going to support their local community. And that's the issue. And that is something that we certainly need to do in Australia. So I want to turn my attention to something now that's a little bit different. And please feel free to comment about this if you wish, because I think it's vital. The other day in Australia, 2 nurses from a hospital chose to get on Instagram or some other discussion group and said some terrible, terrible things about Jewish people. And as a result, this has become a massive issue here in Australia. I haven't got the video to show you because it's just disgusting. So one of the things that we've done then is we've decided that those people, they will be charged for hate speech. They're dismissed from their jobs. They will never get a job as nurses or any other job within the health industry, that's for sure. So they stood before. Now, the argument is, or they're saying that they didn't mean it. It was a joke. This doesn't matter. The hate speech of any description against the Jewish community, against Muslims, is revolting. It is revolting. And we need to find ways to stamp it out. But when you look at places like Sky News, all you see is, what could the government do? What the government's never doing enough. And I often wonder, what is it you expect the government to do? They've passed mandatory sentencing now in the federal government. The Liberal Party have had a go at the Labor Party and particularly Dreyfus, the Attorney General, who is Jewish, in a most disgusting response in Question Time the other day. They've politicised it, and it should be a bipartisan issue, but they have politicised it, and it's become endemic in Australian politics now to focus on what is happening in terms of hate speech, and particularly in relation to the Jewish community. That is not to say that people from the Muslim community don't experience hate either, because they do. And I wish I had. There have been many examples of that as well. And so we're focusing on the Jewish community. And one of the problems that concerns me most is that this has happened since October the 7th, 2023. And people fail to differentiate between the Israeli government's decision to bomb Gaza and to attempt to eradicate Gaza of the 2 million people that inhabit it, and to kill 50,000 people, mostly women and children, and to have a Zionistic approach to Gaza, which is just damn unhelpful. And Trump now has stepped into the bridge and decided that he wants to turn it into a real estate development, which is bizarre in itself. No real solutions to what's happening in Gaza. The result of that has been that many people have seen Jewish people as being the problem. But Jewish people are not the problem. The problem is the IDF, is their government. And there are lots of people in Israel who disagree with their government. And Benjamin Netanyahu, though, is a man who, when he loses power, will go to jail, probably. So there's some effort needs to be made in order for us to understand that what's happening in Gaza, the IDF's response to what's happening in Gaza, is not about Jewish people or their faith. Need to be really clear about that. But this has been turned into a culture war by the right. Not by the left, but by the right. And it's something that we need, I think, to address. So there's this article, when cancel culture goes this far, our democracy is in peril. And I think this is an important article. It's in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think. In the social media age, satire is highly risky because it can be easily misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. In the early days of social media, just only 2013, to think that it wasn't all that far away is amazing. US Public Relations Executive Justin Sacco posted an edgy joke on Twitter satirising US insularity and insularity and racism. She then got on a long-haul flight, turned off her phone and forgot about it. While she was in the air, her joke went viral because no one understood that she intended to make fun of racism. Instead, she was condemned as racist, who reeked of white privilege. Now, her employer was mobbed online by angry and threatening key punchers, one of whom posted, "We're about to watch this Justice Sacco bitch get fired in real time." Sacco apologised profusely, saying she thought there was no way that anyone could think her joke was meant to be taken literally. She was duly fired and shamed around the world. Now, it's interesting when one thinks about that in relation to the two nurses, right? The two nurses said something specifically that was not a joke. It was about killing Jewish patients. That is not funny under any circumstances. Yet hers was meant as a joke and was meant to be anti-racist. Sacco apologised profusely, saying she thought there was no way that anyone could think her joke was meant to be taken literally. She was duly fired and shamed around the world. Said Sacco, there have been numerous other victims of cancel culture before the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel. Cancel culture was condemned and deplored by many conservative politicians and commentators. On the other hand, many progressives said it didn't really exist and that it is merely a method by which the powerful were made accountable for their behaviour. The Israeli-Hamas conflict has essentially seen the two camps reverse position, as I was saying before. And so what we find is that this has been turned into a political debate, a cancel culture debate that has become political, and it is unhelpful. In the course of her presentation, Swartz likened Peter Dutton to Donald Trump, criticising their avowed hostility of many minority groups, while they opportunistically support Israel and its supporters no matter what. One of the slides that she used depicting a character called Dutton's Jew pillared the opposition leader for treating the Jewish community as monolithic and as defenders of Western civilization from other racial minorities. A political opponent of Swartz was in the audience. The slide was photographed and delivered to the Australian. Devoid of context, this slide can be interpreted as deploying a racist stereotype. With context, it is clearly that it is criticising Dutton's stereotyping of the Jewish community. So that thing by Swartz has been turned around to mean something which it really wasn't intended to mean in the first place. You can guess what version now features on a virulent and hateful cancellation campaign where the Murdoch media combines with far-right social media accounts and pro-Israel lobby groups. The ensuing pile on it is particularly vicious. And this is the problem. The problem is that if you say anything, like I've just said, that that is the IDF that's the problem, not Jewish people, that there will people who will misconstrue that and simply say that I'm talking about Jewish people. I'm not talking about Jewish. I'm not talking about the religion. Everybody has a right to their own religious beliefs. I'm not making any comment about that. But the problem that we struggle with is differentiating the two, is to making criticism of those people that are using cancel culture to further their argument and their version of racism, and to not understand the nuances of what people are saying. In fact, to cipher them or filter them through your own misconstrued ideas of what someone is saying or their account of events is really the problem. And so we need to be more mindful, I think, of what this means. And there's this other article on the same topic, which is worth noting. What if the anti-Semitic tide has a bigger target, Australia's stability? Following the escalation of anti-Semitic attacks in Australia, including discovery of a van full of explosives and a note with the address of a local synagogue, there is widespread speculation around what is driving these crimes, who is involved, and why. We've heard assessments from governments that overseas hostilities, such as Israel-Hamas conflict, are driving radicalisation and fracturing social cohesion at home. Last year, ASIO Governor-General Mike Burgess warned that we were in a climate that is more permissive of violence, that reactions to the October 7th attacks and Israel's military response had fueled grievances, promoted protests, exacerbated division, undermined social cohesion, and elevated intolerance. And part of this came about because there were university students protesting at universities around what was happening in Gaza. And that was turned into an inappropriate discussion around anti-Semitism. So on one hand, it seems that you can't protest against what's happening in Gaza because if you do, you're being anti-Semitic. The two are not the same, and that we need to be really mindful, I think, of that fact. More recently, the Australian Federal Police briefed that it had arrested suspects with no history of anti-Semitism in relation to some of these attacks, and as the Prime Minister noted, they were perpetrated by people who don't have a particular issue, aren't motivated by an ideology. But it begs a broader question. Should we blame this increased anti-Semitism on escalating homegrown radicalism and larger tears on our social fabric? Or is it an orchestrated campaign of sabotage? And this is an interesting thing that very few people are talking about. Sorry, I meant to put that on screen. But as it begs a broader question, should we blame this increase in anti-Semitism on escalating homegrown radicalisation and larger tears in our social fabric? Or is it an orchestrated campaign of sabotage against Australia by outside malign actors who are organising these anti-Semitic attacks, not necessarily due to religious hatred, but for their own as yet unknown ends? And there has been some conversation about this being paid for by people who have got another agenda, which is about disrupting our community by feeding us with disinformation and misinformation, a bit like Elon Musk, actually, and whether or not that has been helpful and we need to do something about that. There's an interesting article also, which I'm going to bring to your attention, by Jeffrey Robinson in The Guardian, which I'm going to highlight, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the latest meeting with Trump and Musk. I think that's worth highlighting because I think it's funny. So Donald Trump has declared war on international justice. Australia must speak up. Donald Trump has declared war on international justice by the dictatorial device of an executive order. He has sanctioned the International Criminal Court. This empowers him to seize any funds belonging to the court or its judges or employees and to ban them from entering the US. Who knew that? He issued a similar sanction during his previous presidency, but it was overturned by Joe Biden before court challenges could be heard. This time it will prevent the ICC leaders from entering New York to report to the UN and will end cooperation to provide evidence to ICC persecutors for action against Russian commanders. Well, how convenient is that? The greatest beneficiary of Trump's sanctions will be Vladimir Putin. Australia is one of 125 state members of the ICC, but inexplicably, it has not yet spoken out against Trump's puerile initiative. 79 state members immediately did so, but not Australia, with allies including the UK, Germany and France describing their support of the court's independence, impartiality and integrity as unwavering. They warned that Trump's decision might imperil the confidentiality and safety of victims of the crimes being investigated. Australia should speak out in similar terms. Our judges and our lawyers played a vital part in the Tokyo trials of the Second World War, and Australia made a significant contribution to the trials of war criminals in the Balkans and Sierra Leone, and has fully supported the ICC up to this point. Trump's hostility provides no reason to withdraw from a court which has so much work still to do in Myanmar, Sudan and Congo and elsewhere, since 20 armed and lethal conflicts continue in the world at present. And I thought that was particularly an interesting take on the ICC, which very few of us would have acknowledged. But Trump is doing all that he can to sidle up to Vladimir Putin and to take away any influence that the ICC may have in producing international justice. And we need to be mindful of that as well. So, finally, folks, thanks for being with me for this long and wonderful duration. I appreciate it. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, ring the bell for further notifications. Would be fantastic. Make some comments below if you're watching me on YouTube. So there's this one, which I think is just keep playing on X, appropriately so, I reckon. And it's this of young X. And so this, why in the hell Musk has his son turning up to these meetings, I will never know. But here he is. He turns around. So here he's picking his nose, which is a lovely look. And at the beginning of this clip, though, he turns around to Trump and tells him to shut up. And now, I was thinking, who is the growing up in the room? Is it these two other morons, or is it this kid picking his nose? I'm with the kid picking his nose, because I won't say much more about the particular issue in relation to Trump and Musk at this point, because there's so much that could be said about all of that. But I just want to say thanks for being with me, everybody. Take care. Look after yourselves. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would be fantastic. But make sure that you're caring for yourself and those people that you love.